The Philippine-American War was America's first true colonial war as a world power. After defeating Spain in Cuba and in the Philippines in 1898, the US purchased the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and several other islands from the Spanish. However, the Filipinos had been fighting a bloody revolution against Spain since 1896 and had no intention of becoming a colony of another imperialist power. In February of 1899, fighting broke out between the occupying American army and the Filipino forces. The basic causes of the Philippine-American War can be found in the US government's quest for an overseas empire and the desire of the Filipino people for freedom. In other words, this war was a clash between the forces of imperialism and nationalism. After centuries as a Spanish colony, a revolution led in part by Emilio Aguinaldo broke out in 1896 in the Philippine Islands. After fighting a savage guerrilla war for 2.5 years, the Filipinos suddenly found themselves in a seemingly advantageous position as allies of the United States.
In 1898, Spain fought a losing war with the United States in which her colonies of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam were overrun with relative ease by the U.S. Army and her Atlantic Fleet devastated outside of Santiago, Cuba. Similarly, Spain's Pacific Fleet was wiped out in the Battle of Manila Bay, and American troops landed on the outskirts of the capital city. Following the surrender of the Spanish colonial government in the Philippines to American military forces in August 1898, tensions developed between U.S. and the Filipino forces near Manila. The American government decided to keep the Philippines as a colony, thereby denying independence to the Filipino people. Aguinaldo and his army of nearly 80,000 veteran troops realized that their allies in the Spanish War would soon become foes. As early 1899, American forces held the capital of Manila, while Aguinaldo's army occupied a trench line surrounding the city. On the evening of February 4th, 1899, Private William Grayson of the Nebraska Volunteers fired the first shot in what would turn out to be a very bloody war. Grayson shot at a group of Filipinos approaching his position, provoking an armed response. Shooting soon spread up and down the 10-mile U.S.-Filipino lines, causing hundreds of casualties. Upon the outbreak of hostiles, U.S. troops, supported by shelling from Admiral Dewey's fleet, quickly overwhelmed the Filipino positions while inflicting thousands of casualties. Within days, American forces spread outward from Manila using superior firepower, mobile artillery, and command of the sea to full effect.
By November of 1899, Aguinaldo and his forces had been punished further and further into central Luzon, the main Philippine island, and he realized he could not fight the Americans with conventional military units. At this point, he ordered his followers to turn to guerrilla tactics to combat the American army. From this point on, the war became a savage, no holds barred guerrilla conflict made up of ambushes, massacres, and retribution.
By November of 1899, Aguinaldo and his forces had been pushed further and further into central Luzon, and he realized he could not fight the Americans with conventional military units. At this point, he ordered his followers to turn to guerrilla tactics to combat the American army. From this point on, the war became a savage, no-holds-barred guerrilla conflict made up of ambushes, massacres, and retribution. Both sides engaged in violence and slaughter. Villages were destroyed, civilians murdered, prisoners tortured and mutilated, along with a host of other. Many American officers had served in the Indian Wars and thus supplied the old belief that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. To their relations with the Filipinos, this attitude, of course, was recuperated by the native forces. The war was brutal on both sides. U.S. forces at times burned villages, prevented civilian reconcentration policies, and employed torture on suspected guerrillas, while Filipino fighters also tortured captured soldiers and terrorized citizens who cooperated with American Many forces. Civilians died during the conflict as a result of the fighting, malaria epidemics, and food shortages caused by several agricultural catastrophes. Emilio Aguinaldo was captured in March 1902 and organized opposite from his followers soon faded. Despite the official end to hostilities proclaimed on July 4, 1902, individual tribes in Luzon and the Muslim Moros of the southern islands launched further uprising for another decade or so.
Even as the fighting went on, the colonial government of the United States established in the Philippines in 1900 under future President William Howard Taft launched a pacification campaign that became known as the policy of attraction, designed to win over key elites and other Filipinos who did not embrace Algaro's plan for the Philippines. This policy permitted a significant degree of self-government, introduced social reforms, and implemented plans for economic development. Over time, this program gained important Filipino adherents and undetermined revolutionaries' popular appeal, which significantly aided the United States military effort to win the war. In 1907, the Filipinos convened its first elected assembly, and in 1916, the Jones Act promised the nation eventually independence. The archipelago became an autonomous commonwealth in 1935, and the U.S. granted independence in 1946. Both articles mentioned how the Filipinos used guerrilla war tactics on the U.S. soldiers in the jungles and how they fought for their independence. Some differences is that the U.S. article mentioned how 200,000 people, that includes soldiers and citizens, died in the war, and how a lot of property was damaged during it. The Filipinos article mentioned how 16,000 soldiers died in action and 200,000 citizens died from famine and pestilence, and the millions of pesos of property was damaged. American or imperialism is a myth, just because if one person controls the Filipinos, you're controlling all of Asia, and you have access to all of Asia. So that leads to all of controlling of one area, and one person controlling all of the world is not right and should be spread to multiple leaders.